First of all, I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold flu thing, but hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Welcome everyone to the CRITT Translation Colloquium, a series of talks on empirical translation process research organized by Professor Michael Kroll from Kent State University. And today we have the pleasure of hearing Professor Giosuè Baggio speaking about meaning, translation, and invariance in neurolinguistics, right? Just some information about Professor Baggio. He holds a PhD from Dundas Institute from Brain, Cognition, and Behavior. He teaches psycholinguistics in the Department of Language and Literature at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He also coordinates the International MPhil program in English linguistics and language acquisition, and he is the author of the books Meaning in the Brain and Neurolinguistics, both published by MIT Press. So without further ado, Professor Baggio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karina, for the nice introduction, and thank you, Michael, for the invitation. So let's see if I can again share my slides. So is this looking good?
Yep.
Okay, great. So when I started preparing this talk for your translation colloquium, actually some months ago, I was trying to find something to say about my field, which is neurolinguistics, that you who study and perhaps practice translation and interpreting would find interesting and useful. But then I realized that there is something that you guys, translators and interpreters, know that neurolinguists should find useful and interesting. And that's the importance of invariance, which is right there in my title. So invariance as, for example, in the idea that meaning is the same for sentences in two languages, say, I love my dog in English and io amo il mio cane in Italian. And it turns out that the concept of invariance is extremely rich and productive across the sciences. And this talk is a little exploration of possible connections between the ideas of invariance on the one hand and neurolinguistics on the other. So neurolinguistics, as you probably know, is the empirical study of how our brain learns, represents, and processes language, or more precisely, language as is characterized by our best linguistic theories. So the linguistics bit in the word neurolinguistics, I think, should be taken seriously. So we cannot ignore what linguists have to tell us about language. Now, this raises a number of issues. One is that, as every linguist knows, language and languages can be formally reconstructed in several different ways. So a sensible strategy then is to build on resemblance and convergence between theories and use shared insights to guide research in neurolinguistics. So in other words, in the brain, we should look for those structures and operations that are posited by all or perhaps most theories on the market, or at least those structures and operations that have exact or approximate equivalents across theories. So we want to identify and use invariants across theories as opposed to structures and operations that are idiosyncratic or specific to one or just a few theories. And this is roughly the conclusion that I will reach in this talk. Actually, this is more or less how scientists think, or how they have been thinking for the past century or so. So let's look at a few examples. In geometry, we all remember from school, what we care about are really invariant properties of objects, right? So not just any properties. For example, we do not care about how large a triangle is, or where it is on a plane, or in which angle or orientation we decide to present it visually. So we only care about properties of triangles that are invariant under certain transformations. For example, as you see here, translation, reflection, rotation, and dilation. So the proportions.
Sorry,
yeah,
we're seeing just the first slide. Is that meant like this?
Just the first slide?
Yeah, so we didn't see any progress in your slides.
Oh, okay. No, that's not.
Yeah. Okay, and then you could also make it full screen, perhaps.
So what do you see now?
I see on the left side a large number of small slides, and in the middle a big one, and on the right side some other information. So if you make it full screen,
So what do
we
you
had it
see?
previously, then we would only see the middle slide. But it's also okay. We can also live with this, but it should move forward, I guess, no?
Yeah, so do you see now moving forward?
Yes, I see invariances in the signs, the slide.
So you see transformations and measurement scales?
Yes. Do we see this? These are the boxes in the middle, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let me know if it is not moving forward. But
okay. Okay.
So this,
sorry for interruption.
No, actually, thank you. It's very important. So we also have in physics, right? So this idea that we can measure the same physical quantities with different scales. So for example, temperature. What do we care about when we measure temperature is really what is invariant across different temperature scales. For example, the fact that 2023 has been on average hotter than 2013, say, and that this is true regardless of whether we measure temperatures in degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit or Kelvin, right? So order is one invariant of measurement scales. But also differences in temperature should roughly correspond across scales. So the ratio of intervals is invariant under scale transformations. Okay, so I'm now moving forward, so you should see self-similarity. Is that right?
No, still the same slide, for me at least.
Yeah, same slide, but with another box.
Ah, I see the red scales on the right side and no, something not correct there. But then maybe it's the same slide. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
No, I think we should try to solve this because it's strange that it looks.
Yeah, yes.
So let me share my entire screen then, because I think that's easier. So now you should see invariance in the sciences.
Right.
With 3
yes,
boxes.
now it works. Yes, better.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, it's working now.
You didn't miss much. There was just one slide before this, which is this one, if you haven't seen it, where I was talking about this idea of building on resemblances and convergence between linguistic theories instead of picking one and looking for in the brain the operations and representations that one framework posits. So we want to look across frameworks and pull those insights and then look in the brain for the structures and operations that as many frameworks as possible posit. Okay, so the examples of invariance. So this idea of self-similarity, which we find in physics, we find in biology, and we also find in the formal sciences. This is the idea of scale invariance, right? So structures that repeat more or less identical at different scales. So zooming in or out an object. So think of branching patterns in trees. In neuroscience, we often look for representations of the invariants that the brain might discover in the environment, for example, in visual object recognition. So we can recognize a cat irrespective of where it is positioned in space and in what orientation or pose it appears to us. So there are neurons in the inferior temporal cortex, which is the area labeled IT here, that respond similarly when objects are flipped along the vertical axis. So we say that their response is mirror invariant. So I could go on by giving you more examples of different concepts of invariance in the sciences, and I have a few more coming, but what matters here is the lesson that we can draw. So generally speaking, classical rational science is a search for invariance. So modern scientific theories, especially in physics, but not only in physics, are stated in terms of symmetry and invariance, and not in terms of the traditional notions of, say, universality, necessity, and so on. Invariances are actually used to derive physical laws and not the other way around. Invariants of measurement, like temperature, as we've just seen, reveal the underlying structure of the things we want to measure. So, for example, what turns out to be effect of temperature, regardless of the scale that we are using. And invariants are also used in various explanations, also in the special sciences. So when we talk of relationships between variables that are robust to relevant background conditions, or to a range of independent interventions on the variables of interest, then in those cases too, we talk about invariant relationships. Now, some scholars, and not only philosophers, have gone on to say that what we mean by objectiveness or importance or meaningfulness in science is really one form or another of invariance. But of course, there have been questions too, primarily relating to change and to whether we can find useful invariants that are compatible with, say, the error of time in physics, or the adaptiveness of human behavior in social and cognitive science. So this is a bit of a name-dropping slide, but I hope that it's useful for those of you who are curious about the idea of invariance and want to look deeper into this literature. It's really fascinating and extremely rich. And all these authors, all these names are very good starting points if you want to do that. Okay, but what about language science? So what notions of invariance could be usefully applied to study language structure and language processing? Now, actually, Roman Jakobson and Halley in 1956, that's the earliest reference I could find, noted that the linguistic study of invariance developed intensively after the First World War with the gradual expansion of the principle of invariance in the sciences. So the idea here is that linguistics is following, or at least was following at that point in time, roughly the same epistemological direction as the other sciences, where one of the goals is indeed the search for invariance. So in Jakobson and Halley, invariants are the fundamental building blocks of spoken languages. So famously, they say that a phoneme is invariable or an abstract category, in the sense that it has invariant characteristics across speakers and occurrences or uses. So phonological features would be the ultimate building blocks whose combination defines a phoneme in any spoken language. So these are the universal invariants of spoken languages. Now, this classical notion has been exploited in neurolinguistics, with results suggesting that highly specific cortical locations in the superior temporal gyrus, which is indicated by the red dots in A here. So neurons in this part of the brain respond selectively to groups of phonemes in spoken sentences, and perhaps even to phonological distinctive features, that is, to features defining all plosives or all fricatives, as you can see in C and D here. So there seems to be a degree of specificity and selectivity in the brain response to different phonological features. And this is a good example of a discovery in the neurobiology of language that makes use of known linguistic invariants of invariant phonological features in this case. There is an almost parallel line of work on written language, and invariance here plays an important role in explanations of how children learn to read and write, in particular of the errors that they make during literacy acquisition. Now, some of you, especially those of you who have little kids, would be familiar with mirror writing, right? So the fact that children write single letters or even whole words as if in a mirror. So they flip them along the vertical axis. So why do they do that? So invariance can tell us why this mirror writing phenomenon is happening. So the reason is that before children begin to learn to read and write, they learn to recognize all sorts of visual objects, which can always be displaced, rotated, and flipped on various axes. So remember that panel on geometrical invariants on the transformations that I had at the beginning. So children learn that those transformations actually apply to any physical visual object in the environment. So they learn that these objects can be displaced, rotated, flipped on various axes, and they learn that visual objects are invariant under all these transformations. So for example, a cup remains a cup with all its properties, no matter what spatial transformations you apply to it. Now later, when children encounter these new kinds of visual objects, so letters and words, they initially treat them as any other visual object, applying to them the spatial transformations that any other visual object is invariant under. But now they soon discover that this doesn't work, so they have to retreat from this generalization. They have to learn, in other words, that a D is not mirror invariant, but it becomes a B if you rotate it along the vertical axis, unlike a cup, right? And that is the case for other letters as well. So an M, if you rotate it along this horizontal axis, it becomes a W, so it changes its identity. Whereas if you do that to a cup, that's not the case. So in other words, children have to learn that letters and words are the exception among visual objects in that they are not invariant under all these transformations. So there are regions in the brain, in particular what's become known as the visual word form area, VWFA, which is the highlighted spot in the left inferior occipitotemporal cortex in the literate brain, so in the brain of people who have learned to read and write, that actually shows mirror priming effects for pictures. So this part of the brain responds both to a picture and to its mirror image. So if you flip the picture along one of the axes, but not for letters. So there is this part of the brain responds to a letter, but not to its mirror image. So it's selective to the particular letter that it is seeing, and not to any version of it flipped along any axis. So this is the part of the brain that presumably learns to represent letters as these unique visual objects that violate the laws of visual invariance, which apply to all our visual objects. So I find this a beautiful and elegant explanation of a phenomenon that is very, very frequent in everyday life that makes use of invariance, or of the idea of invariance. So let's now move on to the lexicon, and this is where translation becomes a bit more relevant. So one common technique in linguistics today, especially in computational linguistics, for representing lexical meanings, say the meaning of words, is to plot words as points in space. And these spaces typically have many more dimensions than the two I'm showing here, where the distance between points represents similarity or some other relationship between words. So points that are closer together would represent words that are more similar, so that share more contexts of use, and vice versa. So across languages, we expect to find the same structure of relations between points. So we expect to find words to form similar constellations in these spaces. So in other words, meaning or context of use, so the relationships that are recovered from context of use, should be invariant under translation between languages, so between English and Spanish, let's say. Now, in this experiment, researchers tried to first determine the average cortical response that is evoked by any word in two languages. I believe in this case it was English and Dutch. And they found these classical bilateral perisylvian activations, which are consistent with many other studies in neurolinguistics. So there is often a spot in the inferior frontal gyrus and other activation spots in the superior temporal cortex bilaterally. What they did next was to localize the effect of within language discrimination of words. So the areas that are active when you're trying to tease apart, say, dog versus lion in one language, say English. And they found broad activations, which are shown in orange here, also outside the classical language network. They also find, and this is the interesting bit, a much more focal effect in the left anterior temporal lobe, which is called left ATL in the figure here, and in the angular gyrus, again in blue here, for across language discrimination of words. Say when you're trying to discriminate dog in English versus, let's say, perro in Spanish. So these regions, so the left ATL and the left angular gyrus, are argued by the authors to mediate access to what they call language invariant representations of spoken words in the brain. So these are just a few examples of studies that to me show that if we follow the thread of invariance and actually of different notions of invariance, we can rediscover a number of classical robust results in neurolinguistics, as well as highlight their connections to basic insights about phonological, orthographic, and lexical representations from linguistics. Okay, let's now move on to things that I'm a little more involved in terms of research, so logic, syntax, and semantics. So invariance has been used in formal logic and formal semantics to define logical words and logical truth. So if we do all possible permutations of the individuals in a domain of discourse, which would be the set of things that we use language to talk about, or all possible one-to-one mappings of the domain of discourse onto itself, we find that what is invariant under such transformations is precisely the logical vocabulary of the language. So things like quantifiers, logical connectives, and so on. Similarly, if we do permutations over all models, so that's a technical notion that means the situations that make sentences true, then we actually end up with a subset of sentences whose truth is invariant under such transformation. And those are the logical truths. So those are the sentences that are true in all models. I think this notion of permutation invariance lends itself quite well to experimentation in neurolinguistics. So in this study, which I did with colleagues in Milan and Berlin, we constructed a toy universe of discourse with two objects, two shapes, square and circle, which can have 4 different colors. And we then created a number of different objects like red square, red circle, and so on. And we finally built sentences connecting propositions via logical words. For example, there is a yellow square or a red circle, or if there is a blue square, then there is a red circle, and so on. So in this way, we can vary propositional content over all permutations of shapes and colors while keeping logical form invariant. And we can look for areas in the brain that contain information about the specific logical connective, say and versus or versus if then, regardless of the proposition about these variable objects that they connect. So the region we find is another classical language region. So it's this region in the inferior frontal gyrus, so specifically the posterior portion of the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is where our classifiers were able to decode information about the invariant logical connective that is used across the different propositions. So this is an example of how we can use a fairly technical notion of invariance to design an experiment that help us refine our understanding of what language-related brain areas can do. So we conclude that the left posterior IFG, which is close enough to classical Broca's area, encodes and maintains the logical connection between elementary propositions in a compound. So it's the area that represents the different logical connectives. So there is another angle on logic, which brings in a slightly different perspective on invariance. So Herbert Simon, you may remember, Nobel Prize for economics, said that the invariance that we can hope to discover in the study of human cognition and behavior will not be broad generalizations that hold across contexts, so unlike, say, geometry or physics. So these invariants would be statements of fundamental boundaries and limitations that adaptive systems must abide by. One example that he loved to mention is the capacity limit of human short-term memory, which is a boundary that maybe can be slightly modulated or improved, but not crossed, right? So there's at some point a limit that any finite machine has to abide by in the short-term memory capacity that it has and in other capacities that it implements as well. So when we look carefully at language science, we find a number of results and theorems with proofs stating some of these fundamental constraints. For example, theorems by Johan van Bentem in the 80s, stating that in order to verify sentences containing proportional quantifiers like most or less than half or 1/3, we need a machine that also has a memory component, which is what is called technically a push-down automaton. Whereas for other quantifiers, like the classical Aristotelian quantifiers, all sum, as well as numeral quantifiers like 3, 1,000, we need just a finite state machine without a memory component. So we need a simpler machine. So intuitively, this memory component, this push-down automaton, is needed for proportional quantifiers because in verification, what you have to do is to keep track of how many objects there are in two sets, right? So if we are verifying a sentence like most circles are red, then we need to go through all circles in the domain of discourse. We need to keep track of both red and non-red circles. These are the two sets, and we need to compare the two sets, red and non-red circles, to check whether indeed there are more red circles than non-red circles. And this is a fundamental constraint in Simon's sense. So there is no way to simplify the verification algorithm and get rid of the required memory component. So we have EEG data from a couple of studies now showing that proportional quantifiers lead to distinct neural signatures. So here a larger late positivity, which you see in red in the ERP trace, for proportional quantifiers compared to both Aristotelian, so sum all, and numerical quantifier, things like 3, 10, and so on. So we see this effect only when the task that we give to participants is to verify the sentence, and not when participants have to answer comprehension questions that do not require verification. And this is exactly what the automata theory predicts, right? So it predicts greater verification complexity for proportional quantifiers in a verification task, of course. So here we are not discovering a new invariant because we already had a proof for it, but we provide evidence that the same fundamental constraint that applies to abstract machines, so verification algorithms, also applies to humans, to people carrying out a verification task with different classes of quantifiers. So this is a way to connect, formal computer science research on invariance with empirical research in neurolinguistics. So let me give a couple more examples. So let's move on to syntax. So in syntax, we have three notions of invariance, at least, that are or seem to me to be important. So one, we can already find this idea in Greenberg, who included in his list of universals what he called invariant rules. So conditionals of the form, if a language has property X, then it also has property Y. For example, in his universal 12, which says that if a language has dominant VSO order in declarative sentences, then it always puts interrogative words or phrases first in questions. So the invariant here holds for just those languages that satisfy the antecedent of the conditional, namely VSO order in declarative sentences, and not for languages that do not, so for SOV order languages. So there's therefore an important difference between an invariant and a universal. So invariances tend to be weaker generalizations than universals, so generalizations that hold for some but not all languages. So they are in a way conditional generalizations. But what's interesting here, I think, is not only the fact that invariants and universals are different concepts, but also that sometimes you need invariants. You need to state what the invariant is in order to be able to state a universal, like a law that applies to all languages. Second, and we've seen this a bit mentioning permutation invariance for logic, is the notion of invariance under substitution. So this is used to define functionals, which are those linguistic objects that characterize a grammar. So expressions like function words or morphemes or functional categories like subject and object. So these functionals can only be substituted with themselves. So they are the fixed points in the transformation, in the substitution process. And if you, for example, replace a noun with another noun or an adjective with another adjective, structure doesn't change. If you replace functionals with other functionals, you can expect structure to change. So in this sense, they define the invariance relationships for a grammar. So people like Gennaro Chierchia, Keenan and Stabler in their Bare Grammar book have worked out this proposal in some detail. Although I should mention that there is a debate around this approach, and some have argued that one can use invariance under substitution to identify some but not all functionals in a language. So I'll just mention this idea here, but leave it at that. The third idea, which is the one that I care about the most, is what Kent Johnson has called the invariance principle. And that's the idea that the important empirical question in linguistics is never what does my favorite grammar say about, let's say, a phenomenon that I'm interested in, but rather what does every notational variant of my favorite grammar agree on about the matter. So notational variants would be versions of a theory that differ by the way a theory is presented formally and not by anything substantive. So you can think of notational variants a bit like different measurement scales, for example, for temperature, in that translation from one variant to the other is regimented by rules that only manipulate the notation itself. Now, I think that this is a very important idea, although I would say that focusing on notational variants may be too restrictive. So I would say that the important empirical content is what is invariant across as many theories as can be checked. So whether these are notational variants or not, or whether we know or not whether these are notational variants or equivalent theories. So let's see some examples. So in linguistic theory, we have this concept, compositionality, which says that the meaning of a complex expression, whether it's a morphologically complex word or a compound, a phrase or a sentence, is a function of the meanings of its parts and of the mode of composition, so the way the parts are put together syntactically. Now, compositionality itself has been seen as an invariant, but another important invariant across theories concerns how many modes of composition there are. So a number of different theories, including mainstream generative grammar and formal semantics, and more recently also theories in distributional semantics or vector-based semantics, which is the idea of representing words as points in a vector space, which I mentioned before. So all these theories tend to converge on the idea that there should be at least two different modes of composition. So one mode of composition which applies predicates or functions to arguments. For example, the predicate runs to the argument a man, and this would be the operation merge in generative grammar and functional application in formal semantics. And these operations would be distinct from modification of predicates or arguments, which is the other mode of composition, what some people in generative grammar have called a join, and some people in formal semantics have called predicate modification, which you need, for example, for modifying a man into a happy man or runs into runs quickly. So in an fMRI study by William Machin and colleagues, so they found evidence that predication, which is labeled VP in this figure here, so it's the verb, phrase, condition, and modification, which is labeled NP here, activates similarly regions in the brain like the anterior inferior frontal gyrus, the anterior IFG, the anterior temporal lobe, ATL, and the angular gyrus, all in the left hemisphere. So there is at least one experiment in Lena Pilkanen's lab and NYU, which confirms using MEG that both modification and predication activate to a similar extent regions in the anterior temporal lobe. However, and that's the interesting finding, so the two modes of composition differ in some areas of the brain. So they differ in the posterior inferior frontal gyrus, and they also differ in the posterior superior temporal gyrus, both in the left hemisphere. And we have also ERP data from our lab that suggests that these two modes of composition, predication and modification, correspond to what we like to call globally different processes in the brain, with different ERP components modulated in modification, the N400, and predication, the LAN. Now, of course, these results do not solve the problem of how many modes of composition there are, let alone of how the brain composes meaning. But I think they do show that one can find correspondences between theoretical distinctions. So this invariant across linguistic theories that there should be at least two different operations and patterns of activity in the brain. And this is also a demonstration that it makes sense to take Johnson's invariance principle seriously for a wider range of theories than just notational variants. Okay, so let me then make a final point about notational variants, because I don't think it's useful to give the impression that we can only exploit invariants to discover meaningful patterns of activation for language in the brain. So consider two of the main paradigms in syntactic theory: dependency grammar, which is the sort of graph-like representation that is shown here in the box on the left, and the classical tree-like phrase structure grammars. So this is a dependency graph and a phrase structure tree for the same sentence. So Steve reads the book carefully. And although we can always translate between one type of representation and the other, so these two types of representations are not notational variants. So syntactic dependencies and constituent structure have quite different formal properties, also computationally, with potentially important implications for studies of sentence processing. So now you might think, here we have two competing theories that are different in many salient respects, which could actually give us a chance of finding out which representational format is closer to truth, perhaps in the sense of which one the brain is using to parse sentences. And this is what people have tried to do. For example, there's this recent fMRI study by Alessandro Popolo and others in Nijmegen, which indicates that actually the brain uses both representational formats. So it represents syntactic structure both according to a dependency graph and a phrase structure tree, a constituent structure. So dependency structure explains activation in the left superior temporal gyrus, which is a different area than the area where constituent structure actually explains activation, which is in the left superior temporal gyrus. Right, so we have dependency structure in the left anterior temporal lobe and constituent structure in the left superior temporal gyrus, so which you see here in green. So this is where phrase structure grammars explain best activation, and this is where in the left anterior temporal lobe dependency structure explains activation best. So they say that the two grammars, and I'm quoting from their paper, were not meant to represent contrasting hypotheses, and our aim was not to prove that one is a better formalism than the other. So both grammars can explain variants in cortical areas that are supposedly involved in syntactic processing, and interestingly, they do so for different areas of the brain. So this completes the overview that I wanted to give from experimental studies. So we can perhaps now start to draw some lessons and conclusions about invariance and its potential role in neurolinguistics more generally. So in this talk, I've tried to show that in language science, we can achieve a degree of unification of topics and problems through a plurality of notions of invariance. So the invariance can be anything from patterns and data, which is what current machine learning models, and to some extent our brain as well, would learn to discover, for example, in the case of invariant object recognition. So both our brain and neural networks apparently learn to discover invariant properties of objects in a visual environment. But invariants can also be building blocks of language. They can be properties of languages invariant under substitution or permutation, for example, for the logical expressions in the language or for functional or structural elements in grammar. Invariants can be invariants under translation, so how words are related in a language and how this relational structure is actually preserved across languages. And finally, and perhaps most important of all, for me at least, invariants can be structures and operations that are posited, that are assumed equally by different linguistic theories, so invariants across linguistic theories or frameworks. So invariance allows us to see deep connections between traditional areas of linguistics, between those areas and studies of language in the brain, among other types of empirical projects in language science, but also between different theories for the same linguistic phenomena. So moreover, leveraging invariance allows us to produce elegant explanations, for example, of why children make these mirror writing errors when they are just learning to read and write. But important lesson for me is about one specific notion of invariance. So this idea that across linguistic theories, the meaningful empirical content, so what we should care about, is really what remains invariant, what remains the same across as many theories as we care to check. Now, this insight, I think, has some important consequences. The first is methodological. So in empirical research, and especially in areas of linguistics that use observational or experimental data, what one is expected to do, and this is what we teach our students to do, is to pick two or more so-called competing theories, find where their predictions differ, design studies to test those predictions, and then use the results to declare a winner and a loser. So in this view, through competition, we can progress to the true theory. Now, I think invariance invites us to pursue a very different approach. So what I like to call inter-theoretic convergence and not competition. So we should put together, combine, overlap insights shared by different theories. And the more theories we check, the better our chances that what all these theories identify would be a true feature of language, which we may find in the brain too. So the convergence approach might also help us to improve the robustness and the replicability of our findings, because if we build on insights that are shared by as many theories as possible, then perhaps we stand a better chance of formulating and testing higher quality hypotheses. So hypotheses that have a better a priori chance of coming out true in an empirical test. Finally, and this is also an important point for me, invariance encourages to, it invites us to take a critical look at linguistics education, because right now, more often than not, a doctoral student is trained in just one framework. And of course, this reflects practical constraints, traditions, but ultimately, it is only going to serve a competitive model of research in linguistics and not the kind of convergence approach that we need in language science, including in neurolinguistics. So for that, if our goal is to discover invariance in language and in the mind and brain, knowing one theory or collaborating with people who only know the same theory as you will just not be enough. So we need scholars that are versed in several frameworks and who can translate problems and solutions across frameworks, and ideally who also understand linguistic meta theory, which is where knowledge about notational variants and equivalence of theories is developed. And of course, we need all this to reach and have a positive impact on empirical language science, including psycholinguistics and my own field, neurolinguistics. Okay, so that's it from me. So I just wanted to mention some collaborators who have helped me develop the ideas and the results you have presented in this talk. In particular, Hemming Bremnes, Jakub Zimanik, Iris Van Rooij, and Ryan Neft. And thank you all for your attention.
Oh, thank you, Professor Baggio, for your insightful talk. And if I would like to tell the audience that if you have any questions or comments, you can maybe turn on your microphones or your cameras and address Professor Baggio directly. There's somebody with that raised her hand. I don't know.
Yeah,
Michael, yeah?
Yeah, so thank you very much. This was a very insightful and nice talk. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot. There's lots of questions I have here too. Don't know really where to start, but maybe let's start. So you had one slide where you talked about verification of propositional quantifiers, and
quantifiers.
And you were saying that that you had different lines. I believe the lower line, the red line, was when there was no verification needed for this quantifier, and the two lines, whether the agent needs to verify this partial quantification or not. And I was wondering, so we had this discussion actually with Karina, whether a translator needs to verify these quantifications. And my suspicion would be a translator would not need to verify that. So a translator would, if you say the glass is half full, the translator would not need to verify whether it's half full. I mean, in a usual conversation, you would need to do that, I guess, to continue the conversation. But in a translator, as a translator, you wouldn't need to do that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so the study that I showed, the three lines were all for the verification task. So the red line was for proportional quantifiers, and then the other two were for Aristotelian and numerical. So we are looking at the verification task, and we see that proportional quantifiers stand out in the ERP signal from the other two classes. And a reasonable explanation, which is actually compatible with other findings using other online and offline measures, is that indeed proportional quantifiers are more difficult to verify, precisely because they require this memory component where you have to keep in mind the two sets, because you're comparing two sets and not just looking for exceptions or counterexamples to what the statement is saying. So about your point, yeah, I don't think that translation requires verification, and we actually see that with current deep learning based language models, right, that are very fluent, very good at generating text and at translating text from one language to another, but they're extremely bad when it comes to truth and truthfulness, and whether or not the language they produce is factually correct. So I think these are two very different dimensions of language that often in humans come together. They are often sort of part of the task in which we engage in, but they can be separated. And of course, we can translate perfectly well between a language and another without knowing whether what we are translating is true or false, or even
I would think that the translator should not check. I mean, if they are not supposed to translate the truth, but the interpretation of the sentences. So if somebody translates Trump talks, they would translate all the lies. They would not translate what is really true, right? So a translator should not do this. And do you think, but you didn't test this, whether you would see different kinds of graphs there in a translation situation and in an assessment situation? Do you think that makes sense to look at those things?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, but one needs to find tasks that are sufficiently close, right, between translation with verification and translation without verification, so that you can actually compare processes that are similar or as similar as possible, except for the fact that one recruits verification and the other doesn't. So, and yeah, this is always the case. In our own experiment, we had the exact same stimuli. So people are seeing these images of shapes, let's say red circles, yellow circles, red triangles, and yellow triangles. And there follows the sentence, most triangles are red. And then in the two experiments, the difference is only in the questions that they get afterwards. So is the sentence true or false relative to the preceding picture, or a comprehension question? For example, was the sentence about red circles, right? So people only need to pay attention to what is said, and they don't need to try to verify. Yeah, so again, one needs to find tasks that are sufficiently close, and that's often very difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would like to know a little bit more about the concept of language invariant representations across languages, and how could we apply it to translation, if it is possible to elaborate a little bit more on this.
Well, I'm not an expert in translation or in any area of linguistics where languages are compared, really. So I just have to, I think, warn you that what I said is probably true for maybe a small area of lexical semantics, or a specific way of looking at the meaning of words, which is this, vector-based distributional approach, where you look at co-occurrences between words and you count co-occurrences, you represent these co-occurrence vectors in a multidimensional space. And what you end up with is something that looks fairly similar across languages, right? Because the contexts in which, let's say, fork and spoon are used in English would be very similar to the contexts in which forchetta and coltello are used in Italian, right? So the semantic relationship between words would be preserved across languages, and that's the invariant structure that you're able to see and reveal with this approach. But of course, if you try to scale that up to other areas of language and linguistics, other types of linguistic representation. So we know that sound systems vary and grammars vary quite a lot across languages. So invariance can only take you so far, and I think it's a very important notion for semantics, maybe especially for lexical semantics, but presumably, given that compositional semantics builds on lexical semantics, it would be important for compositional semantics too. So if you were to plot complex expressions like phrases or sentences in a vector space, you might find invariant relationships, so structures that are preserved across languages. But I would expect this not to be the case for systems of sound and grammar, where languages are so different from one another.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? Yeah, in one of your slides, you showed a language network involving the left angular gyrus, right? Yeah, could you tell? Yeah, I didn't remember very well which was the experiment, but could you elaborate a little bit more on the role of the angular gyrus in that specifically experimental paradigm?
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas that we know less about, that is coming up maybe a bit less consistently across studies. What many people refer to as the language network is really these regions in the inferior frontal and the posterior, superior, and middle temporal gyrus, and not so much the inferior parietal cortex, which is where the angular gyrus resides. Yes, but in the matching study, this is one of the areas where you don't find differences between predication and modification, but there is activation in those two conditions compared to a baseline or a control. So that's definitely one of the areas that lights up when the brain is processing complex language. And yes, the other study was the study on English and Dutch by the Maastricht group, where they find a cross-language discrimination of the same word, say dog and perro, which activates left anterior temporal lobe and the left angular gyrus. So yes, it pops up in a number of studies, and it seems to be one of these polyfunctional areas that language exploits in what people used to call higher order association cortices. And we find it, for example, in the same study that I showed on logical connectives, an area that is very close to the angular gyrus, which is the inferior parietal sulcus, for different interpretations of the conditional. So if P then Q, where some people tend to interpret it as a conjunction, which is true if and only if both P and Q are true, and false in all other cases. And some people interpret it as the logical conditional, which is true in all cases except when P is true and Q is false. So we see this area very close to the angular gyrus and part of the same complex in the cortex being active between these two groups. So with one group showing higher activation than the other. So yeah, it's one of those higher order areas that show up in language studies, especially when semantics beyond single words is involved.
All right, thank you very much. So it's almost 11:05, and I would like to know if Professor Baggio or Professor Carl have any final thoughts, if you have any final comments.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. I think there's so many interesting questions and advices also that I found very, very helpful. Yeah, I thought this was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. And so many more questions, but I guess our time is up slowly. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. And if you guys or any of you in the audience have questions, you can just drop me an email. I'm happy to reply.
Yeah. And we already developed an interesting experiment there, no? In the translation situation and the verification situation, I think. Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank you again, Professor Baggio, for all the insight, knowledge, and expertise you so kindly shared with us today. I also would like to thank our audience for their interest. And finally, I'd like to thank Professor Carl for giving me the opportunity to moderate this discussion. For me, it was a pleasure. I learned a lot, and I also have a lot of questions, but we can talk to Professor Baggio in another moment or through emails and so. I don't know if it's my role here, but I quarterly invite everyone to the following lecture with the Professor Juliano Zapata, if I'm not wrong, which will take place on October 6th at 10 o'clock. And I think that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. And it was it was a great pleasure to listen to you, Professor Baggio.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day and a good weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.